Good evening, everyone. I am Shah, an urban planner from Safety University, and I am associated with INHAF since almost a year. I am glad to introduce the webinar series to you all today. So what the thought process was behind all of these webinars. So almost all of us did not need COVID-19 to say that India's urban system is faltering and our cities are not in good health. In most respects, the economy or environment or governance or finance or institutions or slums or sustainability or mobility. It is seemingly endless, the list depending on where you start and what is the vantage point. Some of us have also started taking some baby steps in search of correctives and better ways of seeing and doing things. One of the fallout of managing COVID-19 crisis is the sharp focus in which informal economy has surfaced. Going forward, beyond the virus crisis, the country will also have to see that if nearly 90% of the labor force is in the informal economy, the conditions of working, the entire social contract must change. Also, we cannot leave the slum dwellers and the other poor in the conditions of ill health, misery, and want they are forced into. Moreover, the climate change knocking on the door, if not already in. Both the short-term problem solving and the long-term planning must reckon with the sustainability compulsions and frameworks. With all these cities, will need to be rethought and restructured. Changing all this is no small challenge. Even if COVID-19 shock leaves us with new mindset and resolves us to pursue change, there are many scenarios to what country, its economy and its systems, its approaches to the old and the new challenges will look like. For obvious reasons, the swing is between the extreme ends, like taking somewhat pessimistic but most likely scenario, which projects the new normal as old normal, with the minor symbolic shuffle here and there and inconsequential tinkering of the old vintage. Not much may change. It is unlikely that the day lockdown is fully lifted or 2-3 months down the line, the virus is gone from the TV screens and the government orders on to do what not to do sees coming. People could be rushing, running and honking horns to the offices, factories, shops and Kadyanakas to catch up with the lost money, wasted salaries, stalled productions, missed income and of course the sinking GDP. And as and when the elections in Bihar and West Bengal are announced, we would be our normal, original self, vibrant, noisy, crowd-loving democracy. Corona pandemic would be gone as if it did not ever happen. Do not take me wrong here. The idea is not to write off the change before it has been articulated. The small point is this, that even though there is a chance that our system and approaches could be different, a suggestion is that we see the change process embedded in the old normal rather than the new normal, seeing it practically with governance, attitude, institutions, and mindset not very different. The proposed webinars are seen as opening the much needed societal dialogue and how we handle the urbanization process and develop cities so that they remain engines of economic growth minus the exploitive instinct and systems. To cut the story short, let me revoke the famous Panchashila of Countdown Declaration on the king of cities we want: economically productive, socially just, politically participatory, environmentally sustainable, and culturally vibrant cities. Technologically adaptive while being people-centric as well. The reason for selecting this time is that people are ready to deal with the virtual presence in a reflective frame of mind, even if temporarily prepared to invest energy and time in things they would not in normal times, and are currently receptive to ideas. There is a sense of occasion for such initiatives, and the suggestion is to grab it. So the logic behind the 30 webinars is to able to handle the complexity of the subjects adequately. Also, the webinar series is an integral part of and will feed into an initiative we have launched last year called City, which is Citizen Urban Initiative. It is about multi-level and multidisciplinary societal effort spearheaded by some of India's leading urban and related professionals, developed thinkers and practitioners to work on blueprint that outlines the country's response to the complex urban challenges in a way that ensures productive, inclusive, sustainable, livable, and humane cities for a happy and equitable and harmonious society. So the main themes of the webinars which the series developed are reassessing India's urban challenges, rethinking about the Indian cities, reformulating responses in the context of national development challenges, and not only urban challenges is the task. So here we are at our 14th webinar, which is about building gender responsive urban spaces and services, which would be further anchored by Ms. Kalpana Viswanathan, and I would like to hand it over to her now.
Yeah, thank you very much for this introduction.
Hello.
Hi. Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. So thank you, thank you, Shimul. I think this, I was reading recently that this "am I audible" is the most spoken sentence these days. So we're all thing. So anyway, thank you so much, Shimul. Thank you, Kirti Bhai, for anchoring this and for being the vision behind this whole series of rethinking cities. I think it is, we have come to a moment where due to COVID-19, we have been forced to relook at many aspects of our lives. And though I think many of us were rethinking cities, were interrogating urbanization, were questioning these processes well before COVID-19. And we had our questions, our critiques, our angst about the nature of urbanization that is taking place not only in Indian cities, but in cities in the global south around the world. You talked about, Shimul mentioned the different elements, aspects of the city, the economic, social, cultural, political aspects of life in the city. Now, we do, and I think people like us who've been working in these areas, we are challenging a monolithic narrative on the cities, through our work, through our thinking, our writing, our practicing. But our cities are very deeply unequal spaces. They have been designed unequally. And in terms of, gender, where we talk about gender responsive or gender inclusive cities, our cities were designed primarily by men, but for a certain man, a heterosexual, able-bodied man who went to work in the morning, came back in the evening, and most probably had someone at home looking after all the work of care. Now, when you design a city for that person, you have certain kinds of mobility options, certain kinds of public transport, certain ways that the work of care needs to be organized. And we know that none of our cities are made up only of one set of people. It is a very diverse set of people who inhabit our cities. And today's webinar is focusing on the entire gender sort of a lens on this. So it is not just women, but everybody on the gender spectrum, the trans people, others, non-cis people who are claiming their right to the city, who are claiming their right to decide what kind of a city they want. So we are looking at a more bottom-up, participatory way of looking at a city that is challenging the top-down sort of model that was earlier there. And I think all of us who are working have been challenging that over the past 20, 25 years. But all of this is underpinned by what Shimul mentioned at the beginning, poverty, but also patriarchy. And this has come out, I think, most poignantly and evidently in this period around the work of care. Our cities are built on the work of care, on the social reproduction, but it is never recognized. It is never given value. And the COVID moment where, at least in India, suddenly the work of care that middle class Indians have been used to outsource came and kicked us between the eyes. And suddenly, it was, work of care has to be done because it has been invisibilized all these years. And I think, an ILO, so therefore, when we put poverty and patriarchy together, we are seeing that women are the most, women and others lower down on the gender spectrum are actually the most impacted by anything, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's a natural disaster, whether it's an economic downturn. We have seen that all the major economies today are going through a recession, including India, and we know who are the ones going to be affected the most. For example, a June 2020 ILO study showed that actually 72% of domestic workers in the world lost their jobs in this period. So this is a very, very frightening statistic. A UN study again during this period did sort of point out that by 2021, there will be 118 women, poor women, 200 poor men. So we know there is a feminization of poverty. And that same study also said by 2030, it's going to be 121. So we're not seeing it narrowing, but we're actually seeing it widening. And I think that is what is worrying and difficult for us to look at. And in this webinar, we have really a stellar lineup of speakers. I'm really delighted to have people from such a diverse set of backgrounds who will be speaking to the issue. And the focus really will be on this, looking at the whole arena of poverty, patriarchy, but looking at urban spaces. So we're looking at how urban spaces are designed, how they are planned, how they are governed, how they are managed. And therefore, how do we bring in these elements into that? We're looking at services because we know that a very central part of the urban is also the services, which is not just water and sanitation and housing and mobility, but also services for violence against women, because the other shadow pandemic we've seen during this has been the increased violence against women. Again, it has taken COVID to actually bring to light what feminists and women scholars and women activists have been talking about for the past 25 years, whether it was the violence against women as a pandemic or whether it was the social reproduction and the work of care. And therefore violence and the fear of violence, because we all know that for women, it is not just the actual violence, but it is the fear which determines very often what right we think we have to the city, So fear drives the way that we will allow ourselves and others in our lives to access cities. So I am not going to say much more because we really have many speakers. And I will sort of come in later on as well to bring in questions and others. I'm just going to introduce all the speakers at one go and then ask each one to deliver their opening address. So Professor Cathy McIlwaine is with the Department of Geography, King's College London, and she's worked for decades on issues of gender, poverty, and violence in the cities of the Global South, and more recently on transnational migration in London with a specific focus on the Latin American community. She also works on the role of arts in research on gender exclusion and violence. She's published 11 books and she's worked on research policy interface with the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and she's a trustee at a charity, Latin Elephant and the Latin American Bureau in London. Jagan Shah is the Senior Infrastructure Advisor at DFID India, where he guides the design of the new multi-year urban program and ongoing technical assistance to India's Finance Ministry. But he has previously served as the Director of the National Institute of Urban Affairs, a premium think tank of the Indian government, and has worked in the urban sector for many years, including looking at the implementation of smart cities, heritage cities, the master plan for Delhi, TO reintegration plans. He also taught at the School of Planning and Architecture. Dr. Renana Jhabvala is a well-known Indian social worker who has been active for decades in organizing women in the informal economy, into trade unions, cooperatives, and financial institutions in India, and has been extensively involved in policy issues related to poor women and the informal economy, She is best known for her long association with the Self-Employed Women's Association, and she has written extensively. In 1990, she was awarded the Padma Shri from the Government of India for her contributions in the field of social work. In April 2012, she was Chancellor Gandhigram Rural University and was a member of the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on women's economic empowerment. Dr. Shipra Narang Suri is an urban planner with a PhD in post-war recovery studies from University of York. She currently leads UN Habitat's Urban Practices Branch, which is a hub for UN Habitat's normative work in its portfolio of global governance. The work of this branch covers all major areas of UN Habitat's work, such as national urban policies, policy, legislation, governance, planning, design, public space, basic services, safer cities, social inclusion, the sort of the gamut of works. She has extensive experience in advising national and local governments, and she has worked with the United Nations in many capacities before, with UN Habitat, UNDP, UNESCO, as well as with NGOs in the private sector. Suneeta Dhar has over 4 decades of work on advancing human rights and gender justice. She has earlier worked with UNIFEM at the Delhi and New York offices. She is currently associated with Jagori, well-known women's rights organization in India, as a senior advisor. Jagori has worked for over 35 years to end all forms of violence against women. She's also the co-founder and chair of the South Asia Women's Foundation and has been part of several expert committees of the government as well as the UN and civil societies. And Vani Subramanian is a one-time advertising writer, but she is now has been a women's rights activist and a documentary filmmaker since the 90s. Her work as a filmmaker explores the connections between everyday practices and larger political questions, be they around questions of justice or revenge in the areas of culture, food production, primary education, urban development, sex-selective abortions, or even issues of identity embedded in our food practices. Her films have been screened and received awards both nationally and internationally. So that is our really exciting panel for the day. And we will begin by a short opening, setting the tone by each of the speakers. And I'm going to invite Shipra to start. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kalpana, Kirti Bhai, colleagues from INHAF. Thank you for inviting me today. I'd like to focus my opening remarks on 3 broad elements. Without going into too much detail, I hope we have a chance to have more of a interactive discussion in the sort of second round of this webinar. So I'd like to focus on three elements. One is very briefly, gender in the global frameworks, particularly the SDGs and the New Urban Agenda, and how it has been treated there. And because that's where a lot of us draw our mandate from, and that's where a lot of the fight we can take the fight to national governments because they've committed to these international agendas. The second, I want to talk a little bit about the intersection between gender and other forms of exclusion. I'm not saying gender and other vulnerabilities because I've been beaten up on this before. Being a woman is not fundamentally a vulnerability, and I agree, but other forms of exclusion and marginalization. And third, how UN Habitat and the entire UN system is looking at changes in this space, particularly in the context of COVID, and how we can use this moment, as Shimul was saying, as a moment of opportunity and as a turning point to advance some of the discussions we've been talking about. So very briefly, starting with the global frameworks, we know the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted in 2015, and there was a focus on gender in and of itself on through SDG 5 and on cities and human settlements in and of itself also as SDG 11. But these are also clearly the most evident cross-cutting issues within the Sustainable Development Goals framework within the 17 SDGs. Nearly 60% of the world is urban, and you cannot achieve the SDGs as a whole without focusing on urban populations. Similarly, you cannot achieve the SDGs without focusing on women who make up half the world or more than half the world, if you look at a broader definition, as you said, Kalpana, in the gender discourse, without looking at their rights, their access, the multiple levels of exclusion and marginalization that women encounter. The second major international commitment that I want to quickly refer to is the New Urban Agenda. Starting with the vision of cities and human settlements articulated in para 13 of the New Urban Agenda, which talks about achieving gender equality, empowering all women and girls by ensuring women's full and effective participation and equal rights. And here, I'm not looking at the sectoral stuff, but really talking about empowerment and participation and engagement. And then the elements around age and gender responsive planning, elements around public space, on safety and violence, as well as a consistent advocacy for collecting and sharing gender disaggregated data. We fought very hard for some of us who were part of the discussion around the New Urban Agenda for ensuring that the mainstreaming of that gender is not reduced to a paragraph in the New Urban Agenda, but gender concerns are mainstreamed throughout the New Urban Agenda. And this is really the moment to make sure that they become real. The second part that I want to talk about is really an intersectional lens on gender and other forms of exclusion, as has also been highlighted by COVID, but I'll come to that in a second. We know, and I know that many of you in the panel will touch on these, so I'll be brief. We know that the vulnerability, marginalization, and exclusion from decision-making processes of those communities who are already at the urban fringe, whether it is the spatial fringe or the socioeconomic fringe, are further deepened and entrenched due to gender differences. We know that. We know more women work in the informal sector or in low-paying and insecure jobs. We know more girls than boys drop out of school or don't have a chance to attend school at all. We know that young women bear the brunt of early or underage marriage and pregnancy. We know that more women and girls are victims of violence in public spaces, domestic violence and sexual harassment and violence at the workplace. We know that homeless women and women living in insecure housing face much more and multiple levels of discrimination and violence and exclusion around the world. This is not a developing country issue. This is not an India issue. It's a global issue. And we know that men still make the decisions. What you talked about, Kalpana, in terms of the patriarchy, not just at home, but also in public policy. And often these decisions are not relevant or useful or responsive enough or even contradictory to the needs of women and girls. What COVID-19 has done is that, for me, it has been the biggest advertisement, I think, for some of the issues, as Kalpana, you also said, some of the issues around the divided city or the inequitable urbanization that we have been fighting for. Issues around adequate housing, security of tenure, equitable access to water and sanitation. How will you social distance in slums? How will you hand wash 50 times a day if you don't have water? Safe and inclusive access to public space, mobility, recognition of the informal economy. We've talked about all these. You know, some of us have been fighting for recognition of the importance of all these being central to the vision of sustainable, inclusive, and safe cities. So this is not new to us, but COVID has helped to shine a spotlight on these issues. At the same time, sadly, it has also deepened these existing inequalities. And it has set us back by many, many, many years on some of the gains that were made. The Secretary General issued a policy brief on the impact of COVID-19 on women in April this year. And he noted that across every sphere, from health to economy to security to social protection, and I would dare say urbanization, the impacts of COVID are exacerbated for women and girls simply by virtue of their sex. And we know that the compounded impacts, economic impacts, because women and girls are generally earning less, saving less, and holding insecure jobs. And it's estimated that the total number of women and girls living in extreme poverty will rise to 435 million by 2021 and will not come back down to post-pandemic levels until 2030. So just an example of how the gains have been pushed back. Hard-won gains on some of these issues have been, and some of these numbers have been pushed back. The health of women is adversely impacted because, not just because of COVID, but because resources are reallocated to other things, and there are, health services are overwhelmed. You talked about unpaid care work, which has increased. I talked about gender-based violence and the shadow pandemic. In fact, it's not the shadow pandemic. I would say it is the pandemic for women in so many ways. So these are issues that have really been brought into focus. Third, and my last category of points on how UN Habitat and the entire UN system can envisages change in this arena post-COVID. And I will draw on an expert group meeting we held in May this year as part of our series on inclusive cities. 3 points mainly. One is that a balance has to be found between the large macro issues of political economy and globalization with the micro issues of the daily struggles of women at the grassroots as they strive to build lives for themselves and their communities. Which means basically integrating the paradigm of everyday life, formal, informal economy, care tasks, mobility into urban planning and policy. And the fact that actions at micro level and macro level must support and reinforce each other at best. And at the very minimum, they should not undermine and contradict each other. The second thing the second point that stands out to me, which should give direction to us, is that the issue of gender equality is also linked to data equality. Gender disaggregated data is important, but we also need gender specific data, gender specific statistics to reflect realities and thus shape, better, adequate policy responses. Third, again, COVID or non-COVID, but COVID has sharpened the focus on it. The digital divide is a gender divide. Many women, a vast majority of women and girls do not have access to digital technology, smartphones, internets, apps, which allows them to access livelihoods or education or even information, the right information. And how are we going to bridge that? UN Habitat has reflected a lot on its new strategic plan and mainstreaming gender equality issues into its 4 domains of change on poverty, on shared prosperity, on climate, on crisis. I'm not going to go into it. But I'd like to conclude by saying that as an agency, as the UN system, as a global community, we need to, first of all, recognize and recommit to the fact that women's rights are human rights. 2, we need to move on from seeing human rights as just legal constructs, but actually integrate the moral and ethical dimensions into our programming. And that's a real concern for me as the lead on programming for most of UN Habitat's work. Third, we need to promote a gender equity strategy for cities. It must underpin everything that cities do so that an intersectional gender approach permeates all their policies, plans, projects, and activities. And finally, we need to ensure effective participation, effective engagement in planning and policy making processes so that cities and their spaces and their infrastructure and their services are planned not, as Kalpana was saying, with the able-bodied heterosexual male in mind, but with a woman who has, a single woman with 3 children, with an aging parent to work with and 1 child, and somebody disabled to care for, working in the informal economy. We need to design cities with that woman in mind. I'll leave it there and happy to engage further in the discussion as the panel flows. Thank you, Kalpana.
Thank you, Shipra. I think you've really set the stage and brought in the wide range of issues that is out there, and it is heartening to know that the UN and as a global community has recognized this and is looking at it very integrally. And it is it's good to hear you say that, as the UN Habitat sort of this thing. So before I think I just want to give one housekeeping. All questions, please post it in the Q&A, not in the chat. Every webinar we say this, that people keep posting in the chat, but it's easier for us to answer in the Q&A. Thank you. So I'm going to now ask Cathy to deliver her opening remarks.
Thank you, Kalpana, and thank you, INHAF, and particularly for this wonderful opportunity to meet with you and to share ideas. And I should say it's greetings from London, from me. I hope and I think that there are a lot of synergies in terms of what Kalpana, your introduction identified, and also Shipra. And as Kalpana said, I come from, although I'm an academic working in an academic institution, have engaged with grassroots women's organizations as well as with international agencies. But what I thought would be useful to think about, Shipra's given us this wonderful overview from a really practical, what an international organization is doing in terms of thinking around issues of gender in cities. I thought that I would try and outline two sort of conceptual ways, but not deeply theoretical, but two conceptual ways for how we understand these issues in cities. And then also way of thinking, okay, so how do we address these? How do we address these deep-seated inequalities that we've already heard about from both Kalpana and Shipra? And I mean, in many ways, I'm already speaking to what we've already heard, but you know, why do we need a gender lens to understand these? And here I'll just say something very briefly because it's partly repetitive, which is, you know, since the 1990s, we've had right to the city debates. These, you know, who has a right to the city? The right to appropriate urban space, to participate politically in the city, based on Lefebvre's work. Again, this idea of right to the city is enshrined in the SDG 11 that Shipra was talking about in terms of safe, resilient, sustainable and inclusive cities. However, Lefebvre's work has been criticized for being gender blind in terms of, you know, so-called mainstream, we might call mainstream formulations of urban rights. So basically, you know, the key argument, which again, I think is following up on what we've already heard, is that urban theory and policy tends to be highly masculinist and gender blind. So what I'd like to do in terms of thinking, okay, how do we move on from that? And here, and in both cases actually, and hopefully in true feminist solidarity manner, is that I want to also talk about work that I've engaged with collectively with two very close friends and colleagues. The first was Sylvia Chant, who again is a very dear friend who very sadly passed away in December last year. We published a book which interestingly was based on work that we did with UN Habitat in 2012-13 on the State of Women in Cities report. And then what Sylvia and I decided to do was to actually take that more policy focused work and then think about the conceptual ways in which we did the initial round of thinking with UN Habitat. So I also think it's really, it's an important point to state that, you know, academics, you know, don't just do work in isolation and in their ivory towers, that there is there are really useful synergies in relation to thinking across different sort of so-called boundaries. So what Sylvia and I thought about in this book was, you know, and this is partly why I've put a question mark, is about thinking about a feminized urban future. And here, in many ways, we're stating the obvious, but it's often not stated in the so-called mainstream maelstrom of thinking about cities, which is that women are the majority of urban citizens and will be moving forward, especially in Latin America, just in terms of population. When we disaggregate, and again, we've heard notions absolutely rightly so in terms of disaggregating, you know, women's experiences in city much more intersectionally. But it's also a really obvious point, but it's a really important point to state that cities are also going to be populated by older women for a whole range of issues that I won't go into, but for demographic reasons, life expectancy, you know, sex ratios. And also cities are female-headed households. So women being in charge of their own households. Again, for a whole range of issues in relation to demographic aging, widowhood, abandonment, and also empowerment. And this also links with what Kalpana mentioned around the feminization of poverty. Often the notion of a feminization of poverty is linked with the incidence of female-headed households, which on the face of it is absolutely true in that they often tend to live in higher experiences of poverty or experience higher levels of poverty, although we need to disaggregate that as well, because often women will leave, for example, abusive relationships to set up their own houses. They may be economically worse off, but they may be better off in terms of their wider well-being. So in a way, this is stating the obvious, but the obvious which is often remains hidden in thinking about gender in cities. And so in the book, we then try to think about how transformative are cities for women. And again, this feeds into the work that UN Habitat has done and also continuing to do, as Shipra has spoken about. And Sylvia and I came up with this idea. I mean, it's not deep theorizing, but we were trying to think of a way in which we would frame the book. And we came up with the idea of a gender-urban interface, and I'll show you in the next slide, a gender-urban slum interface. And it's really just a very simple way of talking about the ways in which women's access to rights and resources and assets need to be differentiated when we understand gender and women's position in cities. And I won't go through them in any great depth, except to say that, we're talking about sexual health and rights, reproductive rights, power and rights, assets in terms of physical. Here we're thinking, you can think of infrastructure, financial capital, the urban economy. We've heard about the informal sector, space mobility. This links very much with gender-based violence and fear that Kalpana mentioned. And then disparities in terms of human capital. And again, one of the key points here is that we know that women, as more than, as Shipra said, not a minority vulnerable population, but as the majority population in cities everywhere, not just in the global south, everywhere, they play a substantial role in terms of thinking about transformation, in terms of thinking about economic growth and prosperity. But this importance is rarely matched by outcomes, and we have very significant gender gaps, very significant gender inequalities, underpinned by, thinking back to what Kalpana mentioned, patriarchal gendered inequalities. So again, this looks like a very complicated slide, and I'm not going to talk through it, except to say that this was, again, making the point that we have this gender urban interface, but also that women living in low-income neighborhoods in so-called slum communities experience these inequalities to a greater extent. And again, we've already heard that. And here, so on the left, these are this comes from the previous slide, and then in the dark blue, it's just to say these are the areas, again, which we've heard about already, in terms of women experiencing more time, poverty, income inequalities, gender-based violence, insecurity, more access in terms of political rights and so on. But really the key here is the need for an intersectional, multidimensional, multi-scale approach to understanding women's and men's differentiated experiences within cities and within different spaces within cities. So I also wanted to think about, and again, this relates to my other feminist sister, Caroline Moser, who I've worked with for, again, over 25 years. And some of this, and these are Caroline's words, not mine, more recently, she has brought together her thinking, and I know many of you in the gender field will know about her work, but she's tried to think about urban gender transformation from an operational perspective. So as many of you already know, Caroline has worked very closely in thinking around gender planning and thinking about how we translate sort of academic concepts into usable planning terms, in terms of thinking around solutions. So what I'm talking about here is thinking about, there are useful tools to try and analyze the situation, and there are also useful tools to think about how do we transform cities in gender equitable ways? How do we come up with solutions? And so this partly comes on. I did work with Caroline on the book that you'll see on the right, when I work that I've done on violence against women and girls. But the key point here is, again, thinking about, and we've known about this in our urban feminist worlds for a long time, but it's useful to think about gender empowerment, which often occurs at the individual level and is often around bargaining around resources and opportunities, economic, political, could be social and cultural as well. But that those are often at the individual level. We need to understand those intersectionally, of course. When we think about gender transformation, we're thinking much more politically, much more collectively, and about really addressing gendered power relations, and here we're talking patriarchy, but also wider structural change. So in many ways, it feeds in very nicely with what Shipra has said about thinking about the macro and the micro together, because in effect, this is another way of thinking about bringing the micro and macro together. And here I just mention an example, say from the work that I did with Caroline around violence against women and girls, is that on the one hand, we need to support survivors of gender-based violence, but they also need assets and resources to allow them to leave, for example, a dangerous situation. And then we need collective action, we need campaigns, we need ways of working to address the power relations which caused that gender-based violence in the first place. So then my final slide, and again, this comes from Caroline's thinking around moving from practical gender needs, basic services, basic rights, food, infrastructure, sanitation, to thinking strategically, and then linking that with this idea of urban transformation. And this comes from work that actually she did with Kalpana a couple of years ago around gender and infrastructure for DFID, UK DFID. And it's around thinking around, again, in terms of the diagram, looking at basic needs of women, building assets and capabilities, which is empowerment at the individual level, and then coming up, thinking much more about the transformational potential in terms of addressing power relations, institutional, societal, and structural change. And then my final point, and this partly relates to work that I've been doing with women migrants, mainly from Latin America, in London and also in Spain, is that actually we shouldn't think about cities anywhere as closed urban systems. They're very much much broader, complex systems that not just that interrelate within individual countries within the global south, they interrelate across borders with other countries in the global south and with countries globally around the world. And there are interesting power dynamics in terms of movements of goods, services, information at a global level that we also need to understand when we try and think about this urban gender transformation. Okay, thank you. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cathy. I think you've sort of given a broader framework as well as it resonates, I think, with everybody's saying, and I really sort of the idea of collective action, which has, I think, been central to feminist organizing. So it's not just individual change, and it is I think the original feminist slogan of the personal is political. It is, everything is political. It's not just an issue of changing something small. But I'm going to hand over to Jagan as the next speaker so that we can go through all the speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Kalpana. To start with, many thanks to INHAF, to Safetipin, to my fellow panelists for this conversation. Of course, everybody must have noticed I'm the only male on this panel, but I hope that will not be held against me. I think I'd like to start with some reflections. I think Shipra and Cathy have really set the very sort of, I would say, given us a global sense. I don't mean geographically alone, but really a very well-rounded sense of what is at stake when we talk about, especially when we talk about women in cities. And I will not pretend that I can add to that particular rich framework. But what I'd like to share are some observations or some problem statements which are coming out of some of the work that I'm doing currently. And I think some of the possibilities, and I'd like to just share those briefly. I like Cathy's comment about Lefebvre and the mainstreaming that this whole right to the city idea has created, but that's because of the peculiar nature of rights per se. I think it's important to also think of another very important contribution Lefebvre made conceptually, which was to talk about the production of space and, in some senses, the production of the city. And we shouldn't forget that not enough has been thought about how women produce the city, the space of the city. And that actually brings me to one of my sort of key premise points, which is that what COVID is putting most under stress are commons in the cities. And many urban thinkers across centuries have argued that the city is fundamentally defined by its commons, not by its private spaces. What is going to happen to the commons, and what is going to happen to if we look at it through a gender lens? That is crucial, because women use the commons differently from men. In many cases that one hears about, and not enough data on it yet, but the home is not necessarily the safest place for the woman throughout the day, for instance. Women step out of the home for various kinds of economic and social purposes, but those are also, one might say, either escapes from a particular situation which is domestic or other ways. So, I think we need to think about the commons and add some richness to our understanding of it, and give a gender lens perspective on how we understand commons. The other important thing, and my mind boggles to think about what happens to our whole discourse, which Kalpana, you mentioned, the ILO has been studying, time poverty, for instance. I mean, what happens to time poverty in an age where caregiving, as well as economic activity, as well as other sort of personal and domestic functions, all have to be performed by the woman now, in the same space. So, I think time poverty has definitely got to receive another sort of scrutiny again from this perspective. There are some poignant accounts which come from the non-urban space as well, but really about how, when the crisis happens, the most vulnerable get, even further vulnerable. So the increasing vulnerability, and then, how the gender aspect of that plays out in our cities is something that deserves a lot of attention. But I want to share a couple of points which are coming out of some of our work currently, and perspectives, really. So Shipra already mentioned the digital divide. Yes, important, of course. We are keen to understand how do we help bridge that digital divide, because at one level it's an enormous divide, because it's about infrastructure. Where you have access to telecommunication infrastructure, but it's also a digital divide created by other constraints, whether they're economic or they're social, familial structures and such like. How do we begin to intervene in that, especially with the age group of the girl child in the 8th to 12th standards, particularly? The UK government has a national commitment to girls' education, to make sure that girls complete their education. We are looking at how infrastructure constraints and lack of access to services constrains the girl not only to get education, but also to bridge from school into a work life or higher studies. So we need to flesh that out a lot more. The digital divide isn't really just easily self-represented by those words. The other very important thing, which Renana, of course, is familiar with, because she was one of the first people we discussed with, was on home-based work. The impacts that this is going to have, and the new economic conditions and new economic relationships are going to have on a very large section of working women who work out of homes, and how infrastructure and service constraints again will impact them. When we speak about girls getting to school, for instance, transportation services are fundamental. They happen mostly on an ad hoc, informal level. It's really you're accessing different modes of transport as per need, but can we have a far more structured response to the need of not only the girl child, but but all children who have to get to school and so on, is another problem that we're trying to sort of grapple with and think about, especially now with the concept of a bubble, the idea that there is kind of a protective social bubble that can be occupied. So do we renew our understanding of public transport now from a gender lens? How do we do that? I recall 10 years ago accompanying Jacqueline Bala from the Harvard Law School to a SEWA Kendra in Radhanpur in Gujarat, where we were discussing how we can actually create a new transport system, a paratransit system that get girls to school, and schools weren't always in the villages where they live, so you need to travel a fair bit. So this is something that we're trying to grapple with as well. But to come back to home-based work, it's crucial that women become part of the decision-making with regard to planning, design, and management of urban space and the built environment. And they are best placed to do so. So how do we now equip SHGs and other groups to actually begin to play a much more proactive role in terms of providing, for instance, even environmental services within slums? How do you use grassroots organizations to help people install solar panels and such like? Not a new idea, but again, something that needs to reach a scale where it can have the kind of impact we want. My last point before I stop here is essentially, I think conceptually we need to move from sort of audits to more assistive technologies. So we can certainly do audits, and I saw that in the chat bar as well, somebody has mentioned doing more audits. Absolutely, we must do audits. Audits are a very good way to collect, harness data, analyze data. But that should lead to solutions, and I think the crucial solution is really about helping use ICT tools. And Kalpana, you are one of the pioneers of doing that in the country. And I think clearly we need 1,000 safety pins, not just to look at safety, but to look at all applications of ICT that are possible. For instance, why not a girl child who has to get to school has a specific app that helps her do that. But really the point is that a lot of the ICT usage, and we don't have a number on it, is actually being driven by this large economic engine called the informal sector in our country. A bulk of digital usage, of course, is virtual private networks. It's not people like you and me, but where it is people like you and me, it's a lot to do with informal economic activity. And I think that footprint hasn't yet been tapped enough. Again, Safetipin is one of the few organizations that building innovation on this technology for applications of this kind. But if we want to create healthier cities environmentally and resilient cities, then this technology is a fundamental gateway, so to speak, to a whole host of solutions that protect the interests of women in cities while allowing them access, and therefore, you don't deny access simply because technologies haven't been built with gender lens. How do we do that transition in a speedy way? So I'll just stop at that, Kalpana. Happy to do a discussion later. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jagan. I think these are very crucial points, I think, around the digital divide, but also how do we then harness technology in ways that are productive. But I'm going to hand over to Renana because I think it flows very directly from the issue of home-based work, the informal sector, policies, and so over to you, Renana.
Thank you, Kalpana. I just want to confirm that you can hear me well. Okay, so thank you, and I really wanted to congratulate INHAF on all the good work that you've been doing. I think this is the only organization which is really focusing on the cities. So congratulations, and thank you for allowing me to be part of it. I'm glad Jagan brought up the informal sector, and I wanted to focus on the informal sector. Now, informal sector is, we actually look at it in two ways. There is work in the informal sector, employment in the informal sector, and there are settlements which are informal. And women who work in the informal sector also mostly live in settlements which are informal, and vice versa. Let me first talk about work. 80% of all urban workers, women and men, are informal. And mostly women in the informal sector are women who do this work. The largest number are what are called home-based workers, those who within their own homes produce goods and services which they can then sell in the market. The second largest are casual labor, and then domestic workers, and then vendors, street vendors, those who own small shops, and so on. I'm not giving you the exact figures because it's come out of the NSS, and I'm always doubtful for NSS figures, especially in for women's work. So I'm not giving you the figures, but that's the numbers. All of these workers, all of these different types of women workers face many, many issues which badly affect their earnings. Let me start with the home-based workers who, for whom the home is the workplace, and the workplace is in informal settlements. And informal settlements do not have proper water, sanitation, lighting, the homes are small, electricity. And when you come to policy, then often zoning really affects these workers, because where they live are residential zones, and they're often not allowed to work in those residential zones. Domestic workers, casual workers need to go to work, they leave their homes, and for them transport is a major issue. I remember reading a study that over 90% of women actually walk to work. And that's because, for two reasons. One is the time spent in getting to work if you use public transport, but also the earnings of both casual workers and domestic workers is so low that public transport takes away a major chunk of their earnings. So transport is a major issue, and walking is a major issue, because as we all know, and I won't go into details, walking on Indian streets is a nightmare. And for these women who are not walking for the pleasure of it, but to get to work, it does become very difficult in many different ways. And then those who work in public spaces, like street vendors, or those who have small shops, perhaps they're the worst off in terms of being subject to violence, because wherever they're working, street vendors, for example, are fined by the municipality and beaten up by the police, or sometimes arrested. And the reason, of course, is because there are no spaces planned for them. So, for all these type of workers, who, to remind you once again, are 80%, the city is not enabling, and often, like in the case of vendors, often hostile. And most of these women live in informal settlements. And we know that in many of these informal settlements, the infrastructure, the water, the sanitation, the electricity, roads, the waterlogging, we know the drainage, we know that it's very poor. And partly it's very poor because informal settlements are not given those infrastructures. Not that they can't be given, it's that they're actually not given. And apart from the fact that this badly affects their quality of life, their health, for example, their safety, it also affects their work, because fetching water is a woman's work, and the time she has to spend in fetching water, say from a community tap, or even when there is a tap in her own home, the amount of water that comes out is very little. So that takes away from her work, from her productivity. Just an extra thing which I really would like, Kalpana, if you do get the chance during this webinar, is to talk a little bit about street lighting. Because what in most of these informal settlements, the roads surrounding them, in the settlements, the street lighting is very poor. And that affects not only the work, because very often younger women are not allowed to go out to work just because of that reason. And many women who do go out to work have to come back early, thereby again cutting their hours of productivity. In fact, I know a few cases where women who were domestic workers only worked half the day because there was no electricity. But when electricity came in, they were able to double their earnings. So the two things are really connected. And finally, I think, and perhaps in some ways the most important, is there are no forums, there's no voice, no place where they can actually register what they need, negotiate for better conditions. I mean, we've had many, many examples where when women do come together, and I think you talked about collective action, where collective action can make a difference. But there's no formal structure where this can happen. So how would we really, as informal workers, as people in informal settlements, what do we want to see in the city? First, I think it's very important that this 80% of urban workers must be recognized. And I think especially important is to recognize women workers. And we are often at a disadvantage there because the figures which don't capture a lot of the work speak against us. We feel that there really needs to be planning, a much better planning for workers in the informal sector, like public spaces and street vendors, for example. In our cities, there are no spaces planned for street vendors. When planning takes place, there are spaces planned for malls and for shops and for everything else, but not for street vendors. And therefore, they're always illegal and always having to intrude on spaces which are not meant for them. So planned spaces for street vendors and for others who actually use public spaces like cobblers and especially casual laborers who often gather together to what they call in Gujarati nakas, in corners, to meet, to get work, to meet their contractors and get work. So there are many places where public spaces can be formed to increase employment, and that's very important. Secondly, recognize that informal settlements are also production centers. And therefore mixed zoning is very important, especially where you have lower income housing. Another important thing, and that's a much larger issue, of course, is the location of informal settlements. We often see that informal settlements are settled, and once they're settled, once they're removed, they're moved to a much further place, which affects their employment. Location is one of the most important things as far as informal settlements go. Finally, I'd like to say that we talk about slums. Nobody has talked about slums so far, but often we talk about slums. And I think there can be a big difference between slums and informal settlements. A slum is a place which is dirty, where of course houses are very close together, where there is not enough water, where there is no toilets, where there is not proper drainage. giving informal settlements proper infrastructure and delinking the status, the land status of informal settlements from their infrastructure provision, I think is a major issue, major policy change that needs to be done. Because if every informal settlement is provided with proper infrastructure, it will no longer remain a slum. It will become a settlement. Yeah. That does not mean, of course, you immediately give the title to land. And that brings me to my final point, which is the importance of title to land. And the importance of title to land and bringing women's name into that. When informal settlements are converted into more formal settlements, they always go in the name of the man. And I want to give a recent example. In Delhi, there has been a new law where many, not all, but many what they call unauthorized settlements, colonies, are being converted into recognized colonies. And in almost 90% of the cases, or maybe more, it's going in the name of the man and not in the joint name of the man and woman. So I think that was the last point I wanted to make, that we talk about ownership, but we need to talk about ownership in informal settlements also. Yeah. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Renana Ben. I think that final point is very crucial because, you really have to follow, you have to put your money where your mouth is. I mean, unless women are given resources, nothing is going to really change. And I think the issue of transport, the issue of infrastructure, it's important to notice it's not just the infrastructure in itself, but how it impacts the lives of the most marginalized in our cities. I am going to ask Vani now to share her initial remarks and her presentation. Thank
you. Hello, everyone. Firstly, thanks, Kalpana, for including me in this amazing panel. And thanks to INHAF, and thank you to Shipra, Cathy, Shimul, and Renana Ben. I think, collectively, the kind of issues that have come up for discussion and for rumination really are quite amazing. Actually, I'm a bit hesitant to speak as I had planned, but I think I will just go ahead because I'm coming to this from a very, very different place. Very briefly, I come in as an activist who has worked a lot on issues of gender to do with the city and not to do with the city, to do with many other things as well. But as a filmmaker, as a researcher on the ground, also worked a lot. It's an area of particular interest to me. So I've been sort of dabbling with it in various creative forms. And I think what I wanted to do, and I'm looking at some of the questions in the chat room, and maybe it addresses some of that, I hope. Because I'm not talking at a policy level. I'm actually talking about how does one, try and widen the discourse? How does one reach out to more people? And I just want to share 2-3 kinds of spaces in which I've tried to do some work. Maybe it'll strike a note for someone. Maybe it'll be useful. Let's see. I mean, for me, the session has already been super useful. I hope it does the same for somebody out there. Okay. So I'm just going to share my screen now. I'm going to just show a presentation in which, here we go. Okay. So really, this is what it's called. It's called Thinking Gender, Making Art. I think the idea is really, this is actually my local metro station, which, as we all know, is gender segregated. And we have this, it fits very neatly into a neat binary world where supposedly all the women are safe only if they're with all other women, and all men are safe or non-threatening if they're all, with other men. And the women who do, in fact, traverse into the general compartments, are meant to sit either on certain seats or generally feel a little unwelcome when we do access that public space, because there's the idea that if there is a segregated space, then all of you just belong there. So I think the politics of gender segregation of space is something that requires a lot of discussion, but not for this moment. I wanted to sort of take you through a little bit of my work in terms of, because I'm a researcher, I'm an activist, I make short films, I make longer documentaries. So while I think everything from agriculture to food to the economics of growing food to urban development are all gender-based issues, I have in fact made some particular films on you know what actually Renana is talking about, the right to belong, the right to have, you know, when vulnerable communities in informal settlements are displaced, what is a gender impact. And you know, it was a time when there was a lot of news coverage, but the problem was that really the conversation was not happening among people like us, you know, people in middle class, upper middle class colonies who want the domestic help to come to work, but we don't want that shanty next to our places. And that idea of sanitizing or blitzing up the city, you know, was one of the issues that I worked on a short film on. I've also done some stuff around, you know, around how people of different genders and classes actually experience safety just on the streets, etc. Also try to work with installation as a form, which I'll share a little bit of, you know, as well with you. So I was working with the idea that, you know, that the gendered body is really sort of an opaque presence, yeah? In a sense that we know it's there, we know it's in the public domain, but we see it when we want to in certain objectified or certain kinds of ways, as an object you can lech at, as an object you can threaten, as an object you can own, but not really necessarily as somebody who has a right to that space. Many people have spoken about this, you know, about our right to the city. And I think so I see opacity not as something that is opaque, but that is on a sliding scale. So the idea that we can own and we can vanish, you know, that's something that's a tension between gendered bodies. And this, I don't only mean women's bodies, I mean any bodies that are not cis male and do not exude a heterosexual kind of energy or presence around them. So I started working on this immersive installation where I was trying to break the binary also of the inside and the outside. Because often when we are on the outside, we build a little world that is more private and more internal. You know, we surround ourselves with friends, we pick up that mobile phone, we read a book, we create a little private space in the public to feel safe, to be able to navigate it on our own terms. Sometimes we're in the private, we are more public about something. So I wanted to break that binary. So I was using devices like, you know, like breaking the sort of closed nature of gallery spaces to use reflective mirrors, etc., to bring the outside in. Yeah, so that when you're inside it, there was this disruption of where are you really at as a viewer of the exhibition. So you're not in a sanitized space inside. So there were live videos, there was all kinds of interactive space between inside and outside. At the same time, because I'd done a lot of research work on the issue, I'd used facial testimonies as texts, you know, as in a meeting, someone recently said, you know, bite-sized information that can strike a chord between the person coming to the exhibition and the person in it. I mean, it's laid like this because it was bilingual in a small town in Madhya Pradesh. So I was trying to sort of be sort of more accessible. The other thing is, of course, to insert the body of the viewer themselves. So this is the shadow of somebody who comes to see the show, which becomes part of the show. In the background, this is an exhibition of Dhar in Bombay, where there was a live feed from VT station, from outside VT station, of the crowds pouring out. And this is actually somebody in the exhibition space who, you know, the projectors are placed in such a way so that they're actually cross-cutting, they're cutting through the images outside. So you actually feel, you know that you're inhabiting both those spaces, or you're reminded of the visceral experience of being there. And as somebody, you know, there's no safe space even inside. Safe, I don't mean only in terms of sexual threat. I mean in terms of privacy, I mean in terms of sanitization, in terms of zoning, you know, in terms of how one thinks that, oh, now we're walking into this kind of space. But that definition of this space then becomes more porous, becomes more amoebic, and therefore gets disrupted every once in a while as it changes form. Also, you know, working with translation, etc., which is breaking neat ideas of dimension. So this image, for instance, is something that came out of a workshop, and I'm coming to that in a minute, of a temple that one of the bunch of students took me to when I said, okay, I don't know the town we're doing this workshop in. Take me to where you see gender operating in the city. And the first site they took me to was a Hanuman Mandir in a police station campus in the center of Vardha city, where it says women may not enter the sanctum sanctorium of the temple. Yeah, so we sort of, and we would do what we did in that through those workshops is actually, we do experiential tours. We do observational photography. We discuss them at length. And then what I do is I feel like that in trying to express themselves, not necessarily only as written papers, etc., as you would express classic graduate students to do, I encourage them to sort of observe and think about even their own spaces. So the one on the left is, let's say, the temple. The one on the right on top is actually looking at this job that women have of actually going to collect children from home. And as Renana talked about women walking, so it's part of this job that actually involves them also walking, because most women do not have transport to actually go pick up children, whether it's from the bus stop with the heavy bags or whether it's from across the town as this lady is doing. The third picture is actually the girls interrogating their own hostel rooms and their cage-like structure, the lack of recreational space, the amount of policing of this badminton court by the guards and everyone else who came and went, and the warden's rooms that surround it and so on. So an interrogation of both public spaces, your own space, and sort of locating yourself in this larger question. So one of the other things that I also do is try and introduce elements of literature, of popular cinema, of photography, of various kinds of things. So of course, one of the favorite tales as feminists we always have is to talk about Sultana's dream and the kind of inversion of the fantasy of the inversion in which women can roam free and actually men are actually in parda. While we may not want that in a real world, it helps open the dialogue of what if things were different. So one of the things I encourage in the workshops is actually for participants to make creative work in whatever form. Yeah, it can be a piece of plasticine. We work with plasticine. This is an oil painting which is imagining, Sultana being carried away in this sort of modernistic kind of vision. In another exhibition in Hoshangabad, actually, these two men were actually doing theatrical reading of Sultana's dream, and actually even my own listening of it, it changes when you see two grown adult men reading that and imagining that kind of world and being ready to engage with that idea. So, I'm constantly looking at newer audiences that one can actually do this with, one can open the conversation with. So I've done these with artists, with NGO activists, with school children, with a range of audiences that can actually think that actually, because I feel we need to open this conversation. So this is actually one of my favorite projects in Hoshangabad. In this workshop, there were older men, like you saw in the earlier picture, and then there were very young children. It was probably my most diverse workshop. I think we had 65, 70 participants, from women in their ghungats to their fathers-in-law sitting in the same room, and we are talking about menstrual taboos, so there's all kinds of interesting dynamics. So one of the things we do is when we get out on tours, we also get to unfamiliar parts of the city. So, we are walking around the city, we are walking around, let's say, to where I remember this conversation about smells really took off when we walked into this mechanics lane. And we noticed how male the entire lane was. They didn't know what to do with all of us women and children and all of us walking through this place. We went to a police station, we went to a public hospital, we went to a mithai ki dukaan and the main market, we went back to the riverside. And we started this conversation about how smells tell you what happens in this space. And this map, and we often talk of maps being incomprehensible by a lot of people, how culturally Indians don't understand maps. And I realized that that's all bunkum, if we engage with it, then you can actually make this such a live kind of tool. So I'm actually sharing two kind of examples of what we've done with maps. So this was class 9 children who actually did Khushbuon ka Naksha, a smell map of Hoshangabad. They did the temporary markets, they did the permanent markets, they did the kachade ka centers, the garbage collection centers, they did the ice cream factories. They did a whole bunch of things. And through that, we mapped then, we had a long discussion on who inhabits which part of the city at which time and who is not to be seen there and why. And then we looked at the fault line, the cracks in this kind of monolithic experience to say, okay, but at this time you see women here, which you don't see otherwise. At that time you see men there who you don't see otherwise. So, you know, you start having more nuanced conversation about the city. And through labor, through occupation, through understanding gender, and you see the economy of the place. So it's very, very rich. A couple of examples before I close. So this was another one where we looked at the city of Delhi. And we left these interactive stamps actually for, you know, at the end of a workshop. This was part of of the creative output actually of this architect called Henry, who may be listening in today. But, you know, we asked people to stamp their emotion in the city. You know, like, do they feel fear? Do they feel happiness? Do they feel joy? Do they have uncertainty? So we had a range of emotions, and you had a range of of colored icons, and you got to stamp it. As we developed this idea in another exhibition, we actually asked people to code it depending upon where they're coming from. So then you got to see if people from Nizamuddin East do not come to the West much because they're not comfortable there. But people from elsewhere in the town don't come to Nizamuddin East much because it's just an elite residential colony, but they come for the glamour and the food and the music on Nizamuddin West, you know, but they don't go to the Basti. They actually just go to the Dargah and the market. So, you know, you start getting this other sense of how gender, class, caste, religious and other identities play themselves out in how we navigate the city. Where do we go? Where do we not go? And then we start talking about why. Because I feel that these ways of initiating conversations for me have been terribly important in trying to widen this entire thing. So it's not just me as a creative person, but evoking that creativity in others as well. We've also taken this into schools of architecture. We've had some very interesting work. Unfortunately, I couldn't find some of the stuff in classroom exercises, etc. Looking at even within the home. How is spaces within the home gendered? How are they not just gendered, but how are they also inflected by class or caste or timing or hierarchy? And, you know, so you start having conversations about how a patriarchy operates. You start asking them to express themselves in film. So we actually had final year, you know, productions which were about issues around gender in the city. So these have been, I mean, for me, everything is an avenue to look at how do I look for creative solutions, and how do I encourage you know, creativity that carries these conversations forward. Because for me, that's one of the most important things. I feel that the conversations must go on, and then, you know, we can feed from the micro to the macro and, you know, sort of enrich both conversations through that kind of work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Vani. I think you brought in a very different and live element, which sort of actually just exemplifies what all the other speakers have talked about. As all really good webinars with great speakers, we are running out of time, unfortunately. So while I invite Suneeta to speak, I am going to ask all the other panelists to look at the question section, because there are specific questions to some of you, and also which questions you might like to answer. So after that, we can have just a quick round where each one of you answers any questions that is either directed to you or that you feel you'd like to answer. And over to Suneeta Dhar, who will be speaking, as well as reflecting on some of the key issues that have come up in this wonderfully rich webinar.
Thank you, Kalpana, and thank you, Kirti, by co-panelists. And there are close to 250 participants out there whom we can't see, but hello to everybody. No, it's been a very rich conversation, and especially with Vani ending on such a creative note, I feel like I'm going to do some Gisa-piti kind of information. But let me just put out some points which reiterate to some extent what has been said by the co-panelists, but also highlight a few issues that have come up, particularly in the context of the last few months, as we know that COVID has highlighted the fault lines, as Shipra has mentioned. Now, you know, one of the largest studies that have been done in Delhi, in Jharkhand, etc., has been done by Jagori over a long time, over the last few years. And right now what we're witnessing, brings me to the point that we need to connect the micro and the macro, as has been stated by Shipra and Cathy, and get our data on a much larger scale together, both to influence policy and practice. There's a lot of data, but it's scattered. There aren't common indicators, there aren't common benchmarks, but there's very rich data out there, which we need to bring together to understand the urban and the exclusion of women, not just women, trans, queer, women with disabilities, women from the minority communities, the tribals and the scheduled caste community in India. Now, Jagori has been working on creating safer spaces. We have a strategic framework, and as we keep looking at it, we have learned a few lessons in the last few months, far more deeply. One is that we have begun to understand that violence is really not being looked as violation of women's human rights still. It's still considered a crime that's due to culture, to patriarchal mindset, which it is, but it's also a crime under the law, and we need to assert our rights as equal citizens. The social hierarchies, the power relationships are structural, and they operate within all institutions, and they have been in a far worse state in recent times than earlier as well. It's interesting that during this period, the focus has been on domestic violence, all data across the world, and including India, the reporting has been quite high. Because all this time, women and girls and those across diverse communities have been prohibited to use the public space because of the fear word that Kalpana was saying, of stranger violence, stranger rapes. There's been a protectionism, do not go out, dress, self-censorship, limited mobility, all that. And today when they are at home, we can see what is happening. It was always, the home was never a safe space, but we never spoke about domestic violence. And now the state is talking about domestic violence. So that's very interesting to see that because women are reporting, despite all the barriers, and we know what the barriers are, I will not go to that. We know that there's a link between the private and the public, and how the private has become a public space for women to reach out to the others in their ecosystem. We're also looking at the fact that the ecosystem for violence, which is a very important part of the urban services as well as the rural services, has really not functioned well. We have progressive laws, but we did not have the system in place. And it took a lot of advertising by state agencies, by women's groups to publicize their helpline numbers, to talk about where the shelters are. And we know that few women in the initial 2 months of the lockdown, and then later far more women and girls and trans people, etc., had access to some of these services. But there was no coordination, no SOPs, no special advisories, no special funds available. The frontline workers were stigmatized because they were seen as carriers of the virus. Sex workers were stigmatized. Trans community had to face a lot of backlash and discrimination, etc. And there's a lot of data to talk about what are the forms of violence, and it has been physical, economic, emotional, verbal. There has been rape in the sexual assault in the quarantine centers. We've had a few reports on that. There has been sexual assault in public transport. There's been sexual assault in public spaces, despite the fact that we are now noticing that women in trans and queer community is quite invisible in the public space. The public space has been now taken over by largely men. And we know that in India, the women's workforce participation has been low. Recent data by Dr. Deshpande has shown that it has also gone down further. We've heard from Renana about what's happening to the informal sector workers. And therefore, women with their huge load of care and domestic work have been confined to a private space, no lack of transport, no mobility, no affordable transport. In fact, they've been walking. They've also lost wages and they've lost their jobs far more than men have. And this has taken a huge toll on their mental health. Now, what is it that we need to do? What is it that we need to focus on, and what are the questions that have come up? Kalpana talked about care work. How do we factor in the care work as an important pillar in reconstructing cities, urban spaces, rural spaces? I do want to bring the link between the urban and the rural together. We cannot divide cities. We know that most people who are marginalized, families, communities, single people, live on the margins of the urban spaces, and we have to bring them together. We know the awful migration that has taken place across the world, particularly in our countries. We know what's happening. There's some bit of reverse migration. There's confusion at the moment because people don't know where to locate themselves given the loss of livelihood, security, and benefits. We also know that, I don't know, I think there are 5,000 advisories in our country. I'm not sure any of them addressed very deeply issues of women's rights, safety, and calling violence against women's services as essential services. And I think there's been a lot of advocacy around that. We haven't heard women's voice in governance. This is an issue that has been brought up by Renana as well. Where is the collective forum? Where can you raise your issues? What about the local governments? Where are they? Where are the resources in all the stimulus packages? Do we have any allocation of gender transformative financing for some of these services that are most essential in this period of time for urban and the rural? We also now need to rebuild the public space and women's presence in that public space. We've talked about street vendors, we've talked about women workers, we've talked about homeless women. We also know that activists are working online, and some of them have even dared, many of them across the country have gone into public spaces to raise their voices and protest. To get a police permission is impossible, but they have still done that to make their presence and their voice felt. We know schools are not accessible. We know healthcare services are not accessible as yet. They have not been restored. Immunization has gone down. Women's reproductive health and sexual health services are not accessible. So therefore, we have to rebuild all these services and they have to work together. Jagori did a study, a national study with 7 other organizations across 7 states, looking at the ecosystem of services and looked at the huge gaps that existed in the response to women survivors. And as has been mentioned, it's not just services for the women survivors, it's also having the resources to support them economically, to support them in more ways than one, including their right to assets. We need to reclaim this public space, not just in terms of women's work, which is very, very important, but politically, economically, socially. There have been huge social divisions. We're living in an environment of fear, hostility, anger, blame, stigmatization. And we have to build a new culture of being equal, of being respectful, of sharing our resources far more mindfully than has happened in the past. If women have to get back to work and say new programming gets to be made, we need women's multipurpose centers. In Delhi, there's a whole core group of organizations that are working to put gender into the master plan. And I really hope they seriously are able to do it and take forward some of these ideas. We also need to make sure that we're not looking at transport as this big public sector, private sector transport. Why can we not have women running those transport? Why can't women own some bits of that transport business? We have enough trained women drivers across the country, world over. Why can't women buy their vehicles? Why can't they get loans, skill development, whole range of things that can be done around that. Specifically, what we need is ratifying the ILO 190, workplace harassment in the workplace, which many countries have not ratified, and we need gender responsive policies, interventions, and financing. I will stop here, Kalpana, given the time constraint.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Suneeta, for bringing together some of the key elements. I mean, it's really impossible to pull together such rich discussions. I'm going to ask the INHAF team and Cathy, can we take a few more minutes, maybe 2 minutes for each of the panelists to answer any questions, and then we will wind up. Can we, I know it is 7:05, if we can continue for another 10 minutes, 10 to 12 minutes, and then we can wind up. Is that okay?
Please, you must understand, this could be 120-minute webinar. So you can go for another 20 minutes, 25 minutes, please, because such an incredibly rich webinar that, I would not like this time element to come in the picture. We have all the time under the sun. Please go ahead and do it. Please.
Okay, I mean, just for convenience, I'm going to go back in the same order that we spoke. So Shipra, if you'd like to briefly respond.
Thanks, Kalpana. My goodness. Thank you for the amazing, amazing discussion, the amazing points made, a lot of points made in the chat, and I have been responding to several of the questions in the Q&A, so I won't go into them directly. I want to flag 2 or 3 things that people have raised and others have raised in the panels. One is the whole issue of technology and the digital divide. You know, some people raise the question about, isn't the digital divide a sort of gender blind issue? It's not. It's not. Jagan mentioned it, and I think we need to understand that women and girls' access to technology and access to just the access to even the knowledge to use that technology, even if they have it, is fundamentally inhibiting their growth, their engagement, their livelihoods, their right to access to education, their right to access to information. And I think that is absolutely fundamental, particularly in this so-called post-COVID world where a lot of this is, you know, a lot of discussion is shifting to online and through technological media. And we have to make sure that new technologies do not become generators of new inequalities. This is very important. And they facilitate advancement of rights and freedoms. They don't become barriers to rights and freedoms. So I want to make that one point very strong. The second I want to make is what I want to respond to what Suneeta was just saying on the rural-urban continuum. We cannot divorce, and I wanted to make this sort of, I had it in one of my thoughts when I was speaking. We absolutely cannot and do not. It doesn't make sense to separate and look at urban areas in isolation. And I think one thing that you inhabited, what we are trying to do, is to really look at promoting investment in rural and peri-urban job creation and economies, focusing on women's work and gender equality along the rural-urban continuum. Migrant workers, others who work in peri-urban areas, women who work in the informal sectors, Renana Ben said. So that's the second thing I want to say. A third final point I want to raise is that, you know, COVID or no COVID, other crises, there is another crisis that we face, which is the climate crisis, which is very much prevalent and which also impacts women disproportionately, climate and its induced disasters, particularly in cities. And what's happening also is that solutions in the name of climate change and environment are ending up violating women's rights, human rights, the rights to environment, the right to housing, the evictions we face, the rights to livelihoods. So the recovery, reconstruction, but also climate mitigation and adaptation and responses to these so-called large, not so-called, these large, fundamental, profound challenges that we face cannot be gender blind. Otherwise, we will end up doing more damage than benefiting the world with our interventions. I'd like to leave it there.
Thank you so much, Shipra. And to Cathy?
Again, thank you so much to everyone. It's been really fantastic, and I've learned so much. So thank you. Again, I just want to make 2-3 points that are all interrelated in relation to the questions. There were a couple of questions about the dangers of generalizing about women, and the dangers of generalizing about what gender means. And it's incredibly important. And I think we need to acknowledge that gender does not mean men and women. It can include non-binary, trans, LGBTQ, queer, a whole range of different diversities. And a lot of people have identified the fact that we need to be very intersectional in our thinking. So not only is gender itself a category that is diverse, that we also need to think about the way that intersects with class, race, sexualities, disabilities, and so on. So I think that's really important. Particularly in terms of we understand women's and men's different experiences of the city. The other thing is also, we've talked about patriarchy, and there are a lot of debates about the fact there is no one patriarchy. There are multiple types of patriarchies which play out in different contexts, in different countries, in different cities, and within different cities, and they're constructed in different ways. And there was another question about, you know, can we speak about the global south? Well, no, we can't speak about the global south. The global south is huge, it's diverse, etc. And I just want to introduce this idea because, again, I think it's fitting because it comes from an Indian theorist, Gayatri Spivak, this idea of strategic essentialism. If we want to change, if we want to bring about political change, transformation, and collective action, actually to think strategically and you make generalizations about women's and men's experiences, actually that allows you to then think more forcefully about campaigning, about making an argument for transformation. Of course, an acknowledgement that context matters and grassroots variations, of course they matter, but if you think strategic in a strategically essentialist way, I think it's helpful in terms of trying to change things. Because if we say all women's experiences are individual to them, then it's much harder to bring about change. And then in terms of, and I think that also relates to the idea that when we think about concepts, when we think about, typologies, it's not to say that the world is really simple. It's actually, it's a tool which may or may not work to try and help us to understand the world in a clearer way. So I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cathy. I think this it's a terrible role to try and hurry up the webinar. I don't like it, but I know it's 7:10. So Jagan, over to you. Last few words from you.
Thanks, Kalpana. A couple of reflections, actually. Vani talked about making these projects, but actually what it struck me was that we do need to create the methodologies, the processes by which, in a sense, we begin to discover the city again through a different lens. So that deconstruction, so to speak, of the city from, although I guess a gender lens and deconstruction don't go very well together, but nevertheless, the idea being that can we get to the local level, because really the battle, so to speak, in the emerging future on cities is going to be about adaptation. It's going to be about retrofitting the city. What I will also admit to be a very patriarchal, paternalistic point of view that shapes the kind of planning that we've been doing, that has been, in a sense, defeated, and we are now faced with an urban reality that has to be adapted to change. And in that respect, there are some policy openings which are really exciting, and I think everybody needs to get involved in pushing the right perspective. One is that there is now a national urban planning framework which has been created, and Shipra would know about this. It's because the UN Habitat and the UN require every country to have an urban policy. In our case, of course, there's a problem because it gets lost in translation before it gets translated into state level policies. It needs a lot more work. So I think women's groups, activism needs to also engage with the way in which this kind of a policy framework plays out. Importantly, because one, it addresses the concerns shown about the urban-rural divide. It actually promotes the idea of regional level thinking. And there is, of course, an initial step that was taken by the government through the issuing of the urban planning, the regional and urban planning guidelines, the URD-PFI guidelines. But that has not seen light of day beyond the issuing of guidelines. That does talk about important issues about sustainability, resilience, community level development, and so on. My last point about local level development is that it is, if I was to speak strategically, it's the right space where these issues need to be talked about, because there is clearly thinking that has been going on since at least close to 2 decades about the local self-government challenge. And now how do we get to ward levels? How do we get to area sabha level? In that grassroots development, women will almost de facto become the key agents, and I think we need to move the discourse increasingly towards local development, local area development, local area planning, community level planning, community level processes, because that is fundamental to the adaptation and the resilience building in our cities. So I think it's a good moment, so to speak. Every crisis brings its own opportunities, and I think we are well placed now to bring the gender lens to our cities. Thanks.
Thank you, Jagan. Renana, Ben, over to you.
Okay, thank you, and thanks for this opportunity. And I think what I would like to focus on, and taking from some of the questions and what people have been saying earlier, I'd like to focus on this whole issue of the collective voice. And one of the questions, Smriti, not a question, Smriti from Mumbai mentioned how by mobilizing women's groups, they were able to get a gender plan into the Bombay master plan. And I know Suneeta has also mentioned about the Delhi master plan. And I think that's the most powerful thing that we can do. My experience with the Mahila Housing Trust, which I'm representing, is when women form what we call community action groups in their own settlements and then federate at the city level, they are really able to effect, especially through the political system, the corporators and the councillors and the MLAs and the bureaucratic system. They're able to effect infrastructure policy, changes in infrastructure policy, changes in housing policy, and even changes in planning which affect them. The big gap though is that they have no direct voice. And that is something that we do need to put into the municipalities where policies are really made and into the cities about a space where informal settlements can come together and voice and talk to the policymakers. And a good example of that, which of course hasn't been that successful, but at least it's formal, is the street vendors, where SEWA had been organizing street vendors for a very long time. And then we did get a law in 2014, which ensures that there are town vending committees in each municipality, and the town vending committee has at least 50% street vendors on it. So that's a very formal way in which they can get their voice in, rather than the informal way of through the existing political, bureaucratic, legal systems. So I think two things. One is actually working on the collectives, getting people together, and then working towards a formal structure where their voice can be heard.
Thank you, Renana. Vani, any last words? Last words for this webinar, sorry.
Yes. No, just very briefly, I think that, we've all referred to the city as being complex. And I think that a lot of what we're talking about working at the policy level needs certain kind of dialogue. And if I can call it stereotype breaking at the ground level, because, the city is also a lot of competing, tense, different populations which have very complex relationships with each other. It's ethnic, it's religious, it's caste, it's class, it's all kinds of things, it's gender. And one of the things that I've learned from taking people to parts of the city that they are not familiar with, because, there are different power lobbies. We can have a certain kind of groups that are able to talk about the importance of informal settlements, but there's another power lobby, which is the RWAs and the whatever, which are unwilling to relent to the needs of basti level residents. So in order to actually do that, I think we need to be able to devise ways also to create some conversation and awareness, even if it's at the level of initially of policymakers, of urban planners, like we used to do training of, I hate to say it, I cite it as an example because it's also quite a failure, but conceptually when we thought of training the police, on issues of violence or how to deal with that, I think we really need to make a concerted effort to look at planners, policymakers, architects in the making. We need to think about how do we operate, how do we sort of do some understanding building at that level. I'm going to leave it there for now. Yeah.
Thank you. Suneeta, did you have
big thanks to everyone.
Yeah.
I just have 3 points that I really want to say in the context of right to city. We can't have evictions and smart cities coming up together. We just cannot have it. Our framework cannot incorporate these contradictions and ruin lives of so many families, especially in today's context where poverty is an issue. So we need to redefine that. We need to work on those rights. My second point is that as women's collectives in the rural and urban areas, frontline workers, women community leaders are taking the lead, but they are unpaid, underpaid. Most of the masks and sanitizers in the rural areas have been made by women's self-help groups. And they have not really been paid. They have borrowed from their own savings. Yes, the state will pay, but it's so little. And the market for this is so huge. So what can we do to bridge that gap? And that's where the care economy and the underpayment of women can come in a more central way. We also need to stop the stuff that gender mainstreaming is the way it's going to go. I'm sorry, even in Delhi, I hear this conversation, I hear it elsewhere, factor in gender and it'll happen. We need women's rights to be centered. SDG 5 is there, SDG 11 is there, SDG across is there. I'm just using the UN policy framework because we have signed on to it, but we cannot divorce and take only gender mainstreaming as a pillar for ensuring that things are going to transform. Not just, we need an intersectional gender lens looking across all diversities. And lastly, I think we cannot roll back all the commitments and investments that have been made for marginalized communities and women. If we open that, I think we need more investments instead. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I am not going to at all try and summarize anything. I'm just going to end before handing over to Cathy by on some of the key words that struck me from all the speakers. And they were really the moral and ethical dimensions of building cities, collective action, transformation, the micro and the macro, how we need to hear voices from the ground, the gender impacts of on the ground, which then have to inform policy. So it's not a one-way sort of thing that policy is down. I like the idea of strategic essentialism. I haven't thought about Spivak for a long time. And I think it's true. We have to be strategic when we want to say, these are women's or this is gendered, and when we want to unpack what is gender. And I think that's important. And finally, the issue of data. I think many of you spoke about it. Data is not neutral. Data is also not the new gold. Let us not get carried away by either of these. And let us insist that we need quality data, we need good data, but we need data, like Renana and Vani said, that is produced from the ground, that is actually listening to and speaking people's voices, which then informs policy, as Suneeta just said, whether it's national policy, whether it's city level policy, whether it's global policy. And I think, as Kamla Basin always says, women must be in the homes, both in the lower and upper houses. So women have to be in all houses. So the homes are not just where we live, but it is every part of the thing. And in the political sphere, politics defines gender. Politics defines gendered rights, and we cannot remove it from its political connotation. Thank you so much. I'm just going to hand over to Cathy to, I think, conclude the webinar. Thank you to all the speakers. It was really fantastic.
Wow. I don't know. I don't really know how to thank you, Kalpana ji. It was an immensely rich webinar. In fact, I was thinking all the time while I was listening to you all, how to describe this webinar. It's highly messageful, full of messages webinar that we have put together. It's been rich in content. It has been rich in analysis, rich in concerns, rich in ideas, and rich in perspectives. It's been so rich that I'm in fact thinking of inviting each one of you to get each one of you really kind of putting together a webinar with us. Tremendously, we learned a lot. I must thank all of you, the distinguished panel, which contributed many ideas and perspective to this meeting. And I must kind of thank you individually, and therefore thank you, Cathy, McIlwaine, thank you, Renana Ben, thank you, Shipra ji, thank you, Vani ji, thank you, Suneeta ji, and of course, thank you, Jagan bhai. Even though she is not here, I must also thank my friend Kamala Basin, who was responsible when I was talking to her about this webinar. She suggested that I get in touch with Kalpana ji, and Kalpana ji brought together this incredibly rich panel. Thank you very much again. Even though Shimul has talked about it, let me reiterate this, that the series that we have organized, as she mentioned, we are doing 30 such webinars, and this is the 14th one. And all of these are fitting into a project we call CITIURI, that Citizens Urban Initiative. And that is about citizen engagement in developing ideas, developing approaches, and developing strategies to address daunting India's urban challenge. As we all know, it's a very formidable challenge, whichever we look at it. You look at it micro dimension, you look at it macro dimension, you look at street, you look at water, and you look at climate change. Whichever way you see it, it's a hugely daunting and difficult challenge, and it is very important that we succeed in meeting this challenge properly. We just cannot afford to fail or underperform in terms of how we address this urban challenge. And it's so difficult and so complex that it is too much to expect only government to do it. And therefore, this entire webinar series is an effort to take issues to people, to communities, to experts and specialists outside the government system who know subject. And as a matter of fact, this webinar will tell us how rich we are in our understanding of the issues. And therefore, the message that I wanted to kind of communicate to all of you is this, that we need to kind of use this opportunity to look at and participate very meaningfully in terms of how do we prepare ourselves to meet this urban challenge. I need to kind of two important things before we say goodbye, and that is to tell all the participants, and we have as many as over 300 people sitting in this meeting, that we need your feedback on the webinars. We need your feedback on the subject we are presenting, panelists we have, timings that we manage, delivery quality that happens. If we need this very badly, because with this feedback, we'll be able to improve our performance. So kindly kind of tell us what do you think about this webinars, how they are going, and what should we do to improve them. We are just halfway through. We have 15 more webinars to go. And my last point is this, that the next webinar, which is the 15th webinar, takes place on 9th of September. And this is a very interesting webinar. This is called Natural Cities, Not Mega Cities. And this is being done by two incredibly rich researchers, architect Romy Khosla and a physicist, Dr. Vikram Soni. They've been working on this idea for a very long time, and we are using this next webinar in order to present these perspectives in terms of how they are talking about natural cities and not the mega cities that we see. So with this, I once again take this opportunity to thank Kalpana ji and the entire panel, which has made this a very memorable and very interesting webinar. And I'm also want to use this opportunity to thank my colleagues at the studio INHAF who have been very helpful, who have been very cooperative, and who have managed this excellently. So thank you very much to everyone. Thank you.